A major diplomatic scandal is brewing between Israel and Ukraine. Israel is buying grain stolen from Ukraine by Russia, and there is already irrefutable evidence of such cooperation. The grain that the Russians are illegally exporting from the occupied territories of Ukraine through intermediaries is then sold to Israel. And the profits from this shadow operation are financing Russia's war against Ukraine. And what's interesting is that Israel, on the one hand, says it didn't know it was buying stolen grain, although the question remains why it was buying from Russia at all. But on the other hand, even after a diplomatic note of protest from Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, well, for example, on April 27, a ship carrying stolen Ukrainian grain entered one of Israel's ports. And as it turned out, there have been a lot of such incidents recently. So let's discuss this topic now. My name is Pechii. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and leave any comment under this video. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechii News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So, an important investigation by the newspaper Haaretz has come out, which only confirms the initial information leaks that Israel is not just cooperating with Russia, but also encouraging its aggression against Ukraine. The newspaper's journalists tracked the route of the Russian bulk carrier Abinsk, which arrived at the port of the Israeli city of Haifa with grain in early April. It would seem to be just a bulk carrier with grain. Even then, there were suspicions about the origin of this grain. And now the publication notes that this is not the only Russian vessel that transported Ukrainian wheat to Israel, but stolen wheat. Here is a quote from the publication. In fact, until 2023, at least 2 ships with stolen grain arrived in Israel, and at least one of them unloaded here, according to documents, analysis of vessel tracking data, and satellite images obtained by journalists. The publication notes that the Russian ships that have since delivered grain to Israel have behaved at least strangely, obviously to hide the origin of the grain they were transporting, in particular in their internal logs. In data obtained by the newspaper Haaretz from Ukrainian ports seized by Russia, more than 30 shipments of stolen goods were listed as destined for Israel. Sources of the publication noted that this is already a trend. According to the newspaper, just this year, in 2026, 4 shipments of stolen Ukrainian grain have already been unloaded in Israel. Another suspicious vessel arrived in the Haifa Bay on Sunday morning, April 26th. It is waiting for its turn to enter the port. In an official statement, Ukraine has already emphasized that Israel's permission to import stolen goods from Ukraine is unacceptable. At that time, officials in Tel Aviv assured that they would definitely take appropriate measures. However, that very same bulk carrier Abinsk still entered the port of Haifa to unload, and this happened even though they knew. Ukraine had already found out that it was actually their stolen grain and issued a note of protest to Israel. In Tel Aviv, they said they'd look into it, but told the bulk carrier to come in and unload even though they knew the grain was stolen. Ukraine has already issued a note of protest, but we will definitely look into it. And so the publication traced how Russian ships first load grain in occupied Ukrainian ports, including Crimea, after entering with their transponders turned off. Then the grain is reloaded. It is loaded onto another ship and transported further. The fact that the involved ships turn off their AIS systems when they are near Ukrainian ports and during the transshipment operation, and then they turned them back on a few days later when they were already loaded with wheat, which confirms the suspicion that they were taking stolen wheat from the occupied Ukrainian ports. After loading the goods at sea, the bulk carriers turn their radios back on and head straight to where? To Israel. After several days of sailing, they calmly unloaded the wheat stolen from Ukraine in the ports of Haifa and Ashdod. Last year, Ukraine imposed sanctions against the vessel Sviataya Olga for its involvement in Vladimir Putin's smuggling network. It was involved in at least 4 shipments of wheat specifically to Israel. Another vessel that stands out in the network of transporting stolen goods is a ship called Meklev. It also exported stolen Ukrainian grain specifically to Israel. In addition to the ships Sviataya, Olga, and Meklev, the newspaper Haaretz identified 7 more vessels that unloaded in 2023. wheat in Israel, which they loaded from unidentified vessels near the Russia-controlled Kerch Strait with their AIS systems turned off, trying to conceal the source of the goods. And to complete the picture, it should be added that since the beginning of the full-scale war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, many international investigations have shown that Russia has been exporting stolen Ukrainian wheat by sea, mainly to Syria, Turkey, and Iran. And importantly, the sale of wheat is one of the main sources of funding for Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine. But how do Russians manage to sell wheat on such a large scale and with impunity, the grain stolen from Ukraine? In fact, there are several mechanisms. One of them was to allow Russian companies to buy wheat from Ukrainian farmers in the occupied territories. Well, to document it that way, transport it to Russia by rail and trucks, and then export it to the international market after first mixing this wheat with Russian wheat, the sale of which outside Russia is actually allowed. In addition, the Russian authorities developed a protocol regulating the use of small supply vessels to transport wheat from storage facilities in Russian ports to the sea and from there to ships that will deliver it to customers. At a certain point, due to a lack of storage space in Russian ports, it was decided to use a large number of big ships as floating grain storage facilities. And here is the monitoring. Journalist monitoring showed that at any given time, there were at least 5 ships south of the Kerch Strait that were operating as floating grain storage facilities. And so they loaded grain stolen from Ukraine onto them, brought in grain from Russia as well, mixed it together, and then passed it all off as Russian grain. And here are the documents from the Russian Occupation Administration, which contain a list of 120 batches of stolen Ukrainian grain, and the Russian Occupation Administration's. From November 2022 to June 2023, 31 batches, or 25% of the total, consisted of grain stolen from Ukraine. They were labeled for Israel. Does Israel know that it's buying stolen grain? Well, that's a controversial question. Russian suppliers claim that this wheat comes from Siberia and is being sent west in rail cars. The suppliers provide documents for Russian grain saying the grain is from Russian Siberia, while Israeli buyers and authorities keep a list of batches of stolen Ukrainian grain. And the Ukrainian embassy contacted Israel and warned that buying from these specific Russian suppliers is prohibited. They realized that it was stolen grain, but the fact remains that in early April, Israel still accepted the ship at the port of Haifa, the authorities. They openly stated in the party list that the grain on this ship was stolen, and the last shipment of grain arrived in Israel on the night of April 27. And here is the shipment of grain that comes from the occupied territories. Территории Украины. The administration lists contain a total of 2,200 tons of wheat and more than 19,000 tons of barley. The ship is still waiting to be unloaded, so draw your own conclusions, I'll leave it at that. Share your opinion and your conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like if you want Ukrainian grain. And the documents of the Russian Occupation Administration contain. You can do it with any donation or paid sponsorship subscription using the links and details in the description of this video. There are all kinds of options there. Of stolen Ukrainian. Yeah, this is the easiest way to support the work of this channel. I would be grateful for that. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.